Over the past couple of days, Ukraine announced an agreed-upon ceasefire, which was shortly thereafter rejected by Russia on the grounds that Russia is not a party to the conflict. Later the same day, Vladimir Putin announced a 7-point peace plan, which was then quickly rejected by the Ukrainian premier. Instead, he recommended a 1-point peace plan, the total withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. To help us understand the nature of the conflict, we welcome Chrystia Freeland. She's a Liberal Member of Parliament for the riding of Toronto Centre. Taras Kuzio, Research Associate at the Canadian Institute for Ukrainian Studies at the University of Alberta. Mikhail Molchanov, Political Scientist at St. Thomas University in New Brunswick. And Lucan Way, Political Scientist from the University of Toronto. And we're happy to welcome all of you, as we've said all week, up to the 4th floor here at 2180 Yonge Street, because we had a bit of a flood in the basement and everything's a mess down there. So thanks for rolling with the punches and coming up here today, particularly all the way from New Brunswick. Very nice of you, Professor Molchanov, to come in. Okay, let's show everybody a map to remind everybody the part of the world that we're talking about. This is a map I suspect you've seen many times if you're following this story. It's the eastern part of Ukraine, 3 spots in particular which are starred, where the pro-Russian separatists and suspected Russian military units have centered around these 3 centers in hopes of, well, we shall see. We'll talk about that tonight. Taras, as we look at this map, what does it tell us about what Russia wants?
Well, Russia came in very quickly after the Euromaidan revolution, annexed the Crimea in March. That didn't lead to a major counter-response by the West. They kind of rolled over and let Russia take the Crimea. And then Russia began to support through the use of special forces, providing local arms, and now more recently the intrusion of Russian regular forces, as the separatists were about to be defeated, into the Donbass, which is 2 regions of eastern Ukraine, Donetsk and Luhansk. This is the home base, together with the Crimea, of the ousted Party of Regions and the Communist Party. And so it's a mixture of a kind of a counter-revolution to the Euromaidan, as well as Putin's desires to kind of turn Ukraine into a satellite state and the Ukrainian leader into a suzerain of Russia.
Let me follow up with Mikhail on that. Is it clear to you that what Russia wants and what these pro-Russian separatists in the Crimea want are the same thing?
No, it's not obvious, and I think these interests actually may diverge and are divergent, as we've seen before. On a previous occasion, Putin called against the referenda in Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic. It was not followed. There are other situations when it would be inappropriate to say that what you see is just Moscow's mindless puppets on the ground. I think these people, I mean the separatists, have their own mind, and they pursue their own agenda.
Their own mind, their own agenda, distinct from what Putin may or may not want here.
That's right.
Okay. Chrystia, you've, for those who don't know, your background is Ukrainian in spite of your last name. You speak Ukrainian to your kids. You've been there how many times?
To Ukraine?
Yeah.
I lived in Ukraine for 4 years. This past year I've been there twice.
And plans to go back again soon?
Yes.
What do you see when you consider what Russia wants here?
Well, I think you have to really start at the beginning. And what this started with was Vladimir Putin seeking to make Ukraine into sort of a twin of Kazakhstan. He wanted in Ukraine a vassal state, and ideally a vassal state with a sort of soft authoritarianism, similar to what you have in Russia, what you see in Kazakhstan and Belarus. And the particular deal he was looking for, and he was prepared to pay $15 billion for it, was an economic deal with Russia, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So that's what he was looking for. It didn't start with an effort to conquer Ukraine or invade it. But what we've seen subsequently is Putin, step by step, being absolutely surprised by the turn of events in Ukraine and responding, I think, in ways that weren't calculated. So first of all, he was astonished by the popular uprising in response to the overturning of the European trade deal, which was something that the previous president, Yanukovych, had agreed to do. This was something there was a national consensus around. All of a sudden, Yanukovych changes his mind. There's a national rebellion. Putin is surprised. Putin then urges Yanukovych to repress this national uprising with force. And Putin thinks it's going to work. I mean, after all, from his point of view, it's worked in Russia. He has successfully repressed Democrats and democracy in Russia. He thinks Yanukovych can do that in Ukraine.
But it didn't.
That fails as well. Putin at this point gets really mad. You know, what the heck are these Ukrainians doing? And from a Kremlin perspective, Ukrainians, I mean, I think that the Russian attitude to Ukraine is a little bit similar to the American attitude to us. It's the small brother. Russians feel they know Ukrainians, and Ukrainians should just basically do what the Russians say. And so this was just astonishing that the Ukrainians, first of all, had the audacity to demand democracy, which Putin is really worried about at home. And second of all, that they were uncontrollable. And so Putin lashed out with this grab of Crimea. And there I think Taras is right, that I think at that point there was this great Stalinist memo during the collectivization, where he talked about how they were dizzy with success. Collectivization had been so successful that people were starving and the economy was collapsing. And I think post-Crimea, what we saw with Putin is the Kremlin being dizzy with success. Like, that was so easy. Crimea is now part of Russia. Let's keep going. And you saw this sort of rolling effort to provoke a Crimea-type scenario in this whole strip of land, starting with Odessa in the southwest, all along the Black Sea, and then up to Kharkiv in the northeast. And what's really remarkable actually is it didn't work. It didn't work in Odessa, it didn't work in Kharkiv, it didn't work in Mariupol, which is now contested. It didn't work in Dnipropetrovsk, another Russian-speaking region with real connections to the Soviet Union. The only place where these Russian-led and armed insurgents got traction was the Donbass, and that's the place we're fighting about now.
Lukin, similarly with as we try to make a distinction between a couple of things here, does what Russia want and what Putin want, are they the same thing?
Well, you know, Russia is an authoritarian regime, so we don't really know, and I'm not sure it really matters, because Putin is in control. And I think we also have to look at Russian domestic politics. Putin obviously comes from a KGB background. He's intensely paranoid, and to him, what happened in Ukraine is a potential challenge to his own authority. I mean, he's obsessed with the potential domino effect of a successful example of a pro-democratic, pro-Western government right on his border. And I think he basically wants Ukraine to fail, quite simply, which I think in a sense gives him a lot of options, because he doesn't have to control territory. He doesn't have to, who knows what he wants. He certainly, I don't think people who see him as an inherent expansionist who has had designs on New Russia or Novorossiya for decades, I think is mistaken. He's an opportunist. He wants Ukraine to fail, and he's in a position to do it.
The National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, gave a talk about this recently, and we want to play a little snippet of this talk and then come back and chat ourselves, okay? Roll tape, please.
A divided people is the point of departure for the chauvinistic claim that Russia's sovereignty embraces all Russians, wherever they are. And that has, for anyone familiar with European history, some ominously familiar sounds prior to World War II. It leads, of course, to the concept of protecting compatriots abroad. And the notion here is of an organic, integral unity between all Russians, irrespective of their territorial location, unless that territorial location can be altered favorably in reuniting the Russian people. Think of the Baltic states. And last but not least, the conviction that Russia is not part of the Western civilization, is also not a part of China. It is not part of the Muslim world. Russia itself is a great civilization, a world civilization.
Mikhail, do you see, through all of these actions of the past several months, an attempt by Russia to create a new, broader Russian civilization?
Not really. I think actually we need to focus more on Ukraine rather than on Russia around Ukraine, doing something to Ukraine. What we haven't said is, when we talked about the events of Maidan Revolution and subsequent events in Odessa and Crimea, is the position of people who live there. The Maidan Revolution is in fact a revolution of a part of Ukrainian population, mostly central regions, Kiev specifically, and western regions, and was accomplished specifically for the interest of those regions. So there is no wonder that people in the east and in the south felt disenfranchised and raised in protest against what was de facto a coup d'etat. You can say
just so we're clear, you're talking about
I'm talking
Yanukovych
about
leaving power,
about Yanukovych
interpreted
leaving
as a
power.
coup d'etat.
Exactly. Well, it is. It's you can say the government which was created as a result of this had some revolutionary legitimacy, but clearly it had no constitutional legitimacy.
Because even though he was corrupt, Yanukovych was constitutionally and legally elected.
Exactly. Well, this is of the point. There are many corrupt presidents, unfortunately, in the world. And we believe some of our former prime ministers also were accused of certain things along these lines. So the events which transpired then in Odessa and elsewhere showed the country divided, and this is the fact which cannot be denied. And this explains actually why separatists were successful in the east and in the Crimea, with very limited Russian involvement in the Crimea, and still disputed Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine.
All right, but Taras, I want to get back to that question, which is, do you see an attempt by Putin and or Russia here to create a kind of a new Russian civilization that has less regard for lines on a map?
Well, yes, because where Zbigniew Brzezinski is talking about the Russian people, in the Russian language he's talking about Ruski, and Ruski means also the three Eastern Slavs. It can mean Russian and also the three Eastern Slavs. So Putin himself has used Tsarist language, like calling the Ukrainians Little Russians, calling Eastern Ukraine New Russia. So there is a derogatory looking down upon the Ukrainians as not being fit for independence and having no right to move westwards. And therefore, I think it's wrong. I mean, for example, some people have argued that this is very similar to what Alexander Solzhenitsyn was writing about 25 years ago when he was talking about rebuilding, says forget the Caucasus, forget Central Asia, but rebuild as an Eastern Slavic Union. And Ukraine's the missing puzzle, as Christia says here. And Russian nationalist writers and ideologists, such as Alexander Dugin, very influential now. A few years ago they weren't. Today they're very influential. So to say that there isn't a Russian nationalist ideology around Putin is, I think, very wrong. And going back to the point just quickly on the case of Russian involvement, well, I mean, you know, nobody denies, apart from Mikhail, that there's Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine anymore. If you have Russian paratroopers just straying across the border because they're getting lost, they don't have GPSs. Well, I'm sorry. I mean, I think that's now seen as ludicrous.
As far as you're concerned, it was an invasion.
It's an invasion. Everybody's talking about it in such terms.
Mikhail,
The political and military leaders of the separatists were from Russia.
Okay, don't want to get too far off track here, but
yeah,
invasion
if
or no?
I can, very quickly, don't take my word for it. Taras just said that it's Mikhail's opinion that there is no invasion. Well, may I remind you that on Tuesday, Jen Psaki, a department spokesperson, said that she would not use the term invasion because the Department of State has no confirmation that indeed Russian regular troops are on the ground. Secondly, Organization for Security and Cooperation of Europe, in their last weekly report, said they have no proof there are Russian troops on the ground. Clearly, there is equipment, there are volunteers. Whether or not there is an invasion, which means logistics, command, orders coming back and forth, and so on and so forth, we don't see it. If there is hard evidence of that, I would like to see it. I haven't seen it yet.
Christian, let's go back though to this, and Sheldon, can we bring this map up as well, because we've heard a couple of references already to Novorussia, New Russia, which includes obviously the eastern part of Ukraine. And Christian, I wonder how New Russia, as it has been enunciated, relates to the clip that we just showed from Dr. Brzezinski. How do those two things work together?
Well, I think it's a justification. I think that what we're seeing is President Putin building a justification for his presence in Ukraine. Now, I actually agree with Luke that Putin is not, Putin is very cynical and he is an opportunist. I think his primary and original goal was domination of Ukraine and to have Ukraine as his vassal state. That didn't work, and I think now he's looking for different routes to domination and control. And it's looking as if dismemberment of Ukraine could be a good path to do that, and it is looking as if talking about the defense of the so-called Russian speakers, which is a really odd term when you talk about Ukraine, because really 100% of Ukraine speaks Russian. It's a truly bilingual country. So defense of Russian speakers, or claiming some sort of, carving out some sort of a territory which might somehow have some separate existence. But Ukrainian history is so complicated. You could carve out any number of different territories. And I think that Putin really is making it up as he goes along. What we really mustn't lose sight of is, don't mistake his rhetoric for what he really wants. And what he wants in the first instance is to secure his own domestic control and power, and in the second instance to secure as much power and control in the areas around him as he can. I think something that the world needs to really worry about is we don't now know what rules he feels he is governed by outside his borders.
We will get to the world's response in just a second on this, but Taras, you have written recently that Ukraine essentially has three options in front of it: capitulate, fight, or consolidate. Mm-hmm. Why those three options?
Well, capitulate would be accepting the peace plan proposed by President Putin, which would de facto convert Ukraine into a second Belarus, a kind of a country which was allowed to sort of do its domestic policies, but basically Putin, Moscow would have a veto over Ukraine's domestic and foreign policies. And it would use that frozen conflict, or that state, as Putin's called it, in eastern Ukraine as the way to do that. The second option, fight, would be to hopefully maybe receive some Western arms supplies from, say, Canada, US, and Britain in particular. And NATO talked about that today. And NATO, by the way, said today that there were 3,000 Russian troops in Ukraine, so call it what you want. So that would be fighting. That would be, of course, a long process. It would be bloody. It would more civilian casualties.
Would
more
it be hopeless?
Potentially, but many smaller countries have taken on larger countries and done relatively well. The Croats against the Serbs, the Greeks, Turks, and that's right. But that's potentially maybe not the best scenario. The third one of consolidation would be something which is supported by quite a few West Ukrainians in particular, and that is to say, not take up Putin's offer of leaving this frozen conflict inside Ukraine, but to say to Putin, take it.
Take it because?
Take it because we don't want it, because we don't want, if the choice is between Finlandization or Belarusianization and losing Donbass, then we'll lose Donbass.
Lucan, can I get you on that? Because clearly, capitulate, people understand. Fight back, people understand. Consolidation, interesting option.
Another term I've heard is cauterize the wound. Isolate it, let them have it. And frankly, from the point of view of many Ukrainians, Donbass, Crimea, that's alien territory. You have pro-Russian, anti-EU population. So for them, it's a plus. You're losing, granted, you're losing about 20% of the population. This is a large section of Ukraine.
But it's addition by subtraction.
Right. But you're gaining much greater support for the EU and NATO. And so it's actually really, in a sense, it really supports the reformers' objectives.
Christian, what do you think of that idea?
Well, I'm an elected politician, and I've spoken to some of Ukraine's elected officials, and it is important in talking about the legitimacy of the current Ukrainian government to note that Poroshenko was elected president in May with more than 50% of the vote on the first ballot in a field of 17. There's no G7 leader who has that level of democratic legitimacy. And a problem that Ukraine's elected leaders really feel they face with this cauterization idea is the duty they feel they have to the Ukrainians in Russian-occupied Crimea. The Ukrainians, I don't mean ethnic Ukrainians, the people in Russian-occupied Crimea and in the Donbass. In the Crimea, a particular concern is the Crimean Tatars. They have suffered as much as anyone under Soviet rule. These were people who were deported. They managed to come back. The Crimea is their ancestral territory, and they're now suffering terribly. I think Ukrainian authorities feel rightly that they have a duty to those people. And then in the Donbass, when we talk about the insurgents there, you really have to remember this is a ragtag band of people. There has been tremendous looting. There has been recorded torture. Human Rights Watch has issued some terrifying reports of what they're doing. People there are living really under a reign of terror. And in the areas in that region that the Ukrainian army liberated, you had people really saying, thank goodness that you're here. So, it's not purely a question from the point of view of the authorities in Kiev of a geopolitical chessboard. They also have a responsibility to their people.
Mikhail, can I find out which of those three options you think is the most advisable?
I think the most advisable is the fourth option,
which is
negotiate between Kiev and separatists in Donbass, who are, by the way, no longer separatists, as they agree to stay in Ukraine as a result of devolution of power, so some sort of federal arrangement. And that would be, if we talk about not my personal likings, but from the point of view what is best for the people of Ukraine, is, in my view, it's obvious, should be at least obvious for any normal person, that the only thing which should be done is to stop killings. And for now, the only person who talks about that is, lo and behold, Russian President Putin. So, yes, situation of war, as Christy said, clearly brings horrible crimes on all sides. Human Rights Watch noticed torture on both sides. Ukrainian troops are shelling and bombing their own cities. 1 million people are displaced. And rather than address this situation, we are talking about how to contain Putin. We should contain the government which oppresses its own people by killing civilians in population of its own country. And by the way, this third option of consolidate, which was advanced by Professor Motyl, actually shows something about the fact that Ukraine is indeed a community of two ethnic nations, Russophone and Ukrainophone. And some of Ukrainophones, some of Ukrainian nationalists actually go as far as to completely disenfranchise this other community, say let them go, let them be grabbed by Putin, by whoever else, we don't want to deal with them. And this is a tragedy, I think, for elected politicians like Poroshenko, that he became a victim and a hostage to extreme nationalist politics, to representative of Svoboda and the right sector, and a neo-fascist group, which actually includes 4 ministers in the government. And now he cannot say the obvious thing, which it would be, let's stop killing our brothers.
Let's just cover it. Luke, and I'll get you in a second, but let's, Christian, we do have to acknowledge, right, there are 4 neo-fascists in this Ukrainian, democratically elected, but yet still, for many, problematic Ukrainian government. That is true, isn't it?
I think actually we really need to push back against this notion that the Maidan revolution was an extreme right-wing revolution, and the presidential elections were a real confirmation of that. In the presidential election, there were 2 candidates of the far right. Neither of them polled more than 2%. And this happened on the same day that you had elections to the European Parliament. You had higher votes for the far right in countries like France and the Netherlands than you did in Ukraine. So this notion that the far right is dominating Ukraine.
Not dominating, but a part of it. It's a part of the action.
It is much less a part of the action than in Western Europe, and in fact much less a part of the action than in Russia.
Okay.
And just a quick point here, since you've raised the point of the far right, something to really note is that Putin has been actively courting the Western European far right. He's been convening them in conferences and soliciting their support. So it's really, really rich to hear from the Kremlin accusations that this is some sort of a fascist coup.
Yeah. I just want to say, I think that it is true that there were what we would normally consider extremists within the first Ukrainian government from extremist parties. At the same time, it's even more important that, one, the demonstrators were not reflecting those views, as Christy said in the election. And second, also important, the policies of the government have been extraordinarily moderate. I mean, if this was an extremist Ukrainian national government, why did they sit back and do nothing about Crimea? Why haven't you seen many more paramilitaries? I mean, these are pretty lame extremists, if this is what you call extremism. I mean, frankly. So I think it's important to keep in mind. I mean, it's not a complete illusion that there were extremists initially, but they have never had any power in the government, nor have they had wide support.
Okay. Well, yes, you wanted to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think adding to this and sort of countering a bit of what Mikhail's been saying, he's talking about as though there are 2 groups, Ukrainophones and Russophones in Ukraine, which is absolutely not the case. As Christia said, of the 8 Russian-speaking regions of east and southern Ukraine, 6 of them did not support Putin's plans. They're all Russian speakers. So the idea that somehow all of these Russian speakers belong to one sort of entity is simply not true. Secondly, the Jews of Ukraine. There's one Jewish member of the cabinet, but the Jewish organizations of Ukraine who Putin wanted to use against the Euromaidan, they are supporting the Ukrainian authorities. All of them. There's not a single dissenter. I was in May in Dnipropetrovsk, and I stayed in I think it's the biggest Jewish complex in Europe. Second biggest synagogue, if I'm not mistaken. And it's funded by the current governor of Dnipropetrovsk, Igor Kolomoisky, who funds some of these volunteer battalions. So, I mean, I think, it's far more nuanced. And on a final note, let's look at the Russian fascists here, real fascists. The leader of the Crimea is a member of the Russian National Unity Party. That party does Sieg Heils at their congresses. Why does Mikhail not talk about these Russian fascists?
Let's give him a chance to respond to that. Do you want to?
Well, as far as I recall, Svoboda members also give Sieg Heils, and that actually happened in Maidan. And indeed, I agree that the revolution in February invoked various forces and various people, and I had friends there in Maidan. They were clearly liberals, but the striking force of that revolution was neo-fascists, who do exactly that greeting that Taras just mentioned. And this striking force occupied Ukrainian parliament, Verkhovna Rada, and this striking force actually forced President Yanukovych out of power in contravention of agreement signed with European foreign ministers. Once again, this striking force holds the Ukrainian president hostage now in the continuation of the conflict. And until we address this issue, we will not move anywhere. And I think we should be addressing this issue rather than trading accusations, whether more fascists and...
I actually want to move us on to one other thing, which is what we should do now, what NATO can do now. Canada, of course, part of NATO. The Prime Minister of Canada has talked very tough on this file ever since it became significant in the world headlines. And I want to get a better sense from the four of you about what should take place right now. To that end, I've mentioned Stephen Harper's tough talk. I've also, we have to note the speech given yesterday, I guess, by Barack Obama, which has been described by some as the toughest kind of Cold War rhetoric we have seen since Ronald Reagan was President of the United States. Almost regarding certainly the Baltics as being well within NATO's interest, and almost treating Ukraine as a fellow NATO member, saying we're going to be there for you and Russia had better keep its hands off. On the other hand, Lucan, I've also heard it said that there's no way the West can care more about what happens to eastern Ukraine than Vladimir Putin does. There's no way. So where are we?
Absolutely. Now, I think the tragedy is that Putin will always be in the driver's seat when it comes to this crisis. He will always be more willing and more capable of escalating the conflict militarily than the West will. And that's the problem, right? I mean, hundreds of miles of border, military equipment, energy resources, he controls the crisis. And I think the problem is that basically it's hard to imagine a scenario where Ukraine wins this, right? Because every time you have an agreement, Putin will do what he just did, which will just amp it up. Every time the separatists are about to be defeated, he'll just amp it up again. I mean, and he's used a fraction of his military capacity so far, right? I mean, there's even, I think there has been an invasion. I think it's important to recognize. But the fact that we're even questioning it means that Putin's been successful, right? What can we do? I think it's a cliche, but I think talk softly and carry a big stick, which means basically we have to make it costly for Putin to do what he's doing. At the same time, I think we don't want to actually amp up the rhetoric, because what Putin really wants is another Cold War. The Cold War for us is when things were bad and the world was divided. For him, the Cold War was when Russia meant something, right? When being the head of the Russia meant you were a world power.
It was a bipolar world then.
He loved it. So the more we engage in this kind of rhetoric, the more it sort of feeds his own support base and his own propaganda machine, and makes it more politically advantageous for him to continue this conflict.
Christian, where are we?
Well, I agree with a lot of what Lucas said, and I'd like to pull out 2 points. I do agree that this isn't another Cold War, and we shouldn't be framing it that way. I think the key security issue, and the reason that this isn't just a matter for Ukrainians and Russians and Eastern Ukrainians. The reason that this has really risen to the top, I think, of the international agenda is something unprecedented has happened. Unprecedented, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, probably since the end of the since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And that is that one sovereign European state has invaded and annexed the territory of another. The post-collapse of the Soviet Union settlement, the whole new European order has been based on an understanding that wouldn't happen. That was the understanding upon which the Soviet Union dissolved. That was the understanding, for example, which governed Europe's and the world's really limited response to the horrible Russian suppression of separatist movements in Chechnya.
I don't want to quibble with you, but has this not happened already? Has this not happened in Georgia, or has this not happened in other former neighboring Soviet republics?
Crimea is different because that was an actual annexation. Russia moved a further step, and Russia has said Crimea is now Russian territory. And so that, I think that we underreacted to what happened in Georgia, and maybe had we reacted more strongly, we wouldn't see what's happening today. But the annexation of Crimea is another real step. And the reason that you're hearing particularly European foreign ministers take this so seriously, Carl Bildt, the foreign minister of Sweden, gave a great speech in Berlin in June where he said this is a threat to all peace and stability in Europe. And that's absolutely right. And there are lots of little conflicts, right? Hungary has expressed some territorial ambitions, for example. If it becomes okay, if the only issue is who has more tanks and soldiers, and you're allowed to start redrawing the borders of Europe, we all know where that ends. So it's really, really important to understand that and to see that as our key frame. What do we do about it? I think Luke's point that we have to make it really, really costly for Putin. And I wouldn't underestimate the impact of the economic sanctions that have already been imposed on Russia, and I think we have to go much further. David Cameron in Britain has been talking about cutting Russian banks off of the SWIFT system. I think that would be a very, very powerful step. And these things, they don't have to have an impact immediately. They don't have to change what Putin does tomorrow, but maybe they change what he does over 6 months, and that's important.
Okay, let me get you on the first part of that, Mikhail, which is, in spite of the very powerful statement made by President Obama, the fact is it's Putin's neighborhood. Will he always have the upper hand, therefore?
Well, Russia will always remain a big power in the neighborhood, but I would like to address your question on what should be done now. I think what should be done is actually the peace plan, which was advanced by Putin, has to be followed with international supervision, which is part of the 7-point plan, which would verify that there are no alleged supplies of weapons or armaments or volunteers or whoever, troops which were lost somehow in eastern Ukraine. So these international monitors would have to observe that indeed the hostility stopped on the ground and that restoration goes. And then what amazes me always in these talks about Russia somehow manipulating Ukraine is how little credit we give to Ukrainian government, how little credit we give to elected Ukrainian authorities. We all celebrate them, but somehow we don't believe they can stand up to Russia. They can prevent Kazakhization or Belarusinization of Ukraine if only some limited autonomous rights are given to the people who demanded those rights in peaceful way before they were shelled, before they were called terrorists, before government sent troops on them. Let me remind you that former President Yanukovych is now considered criminal according to Ukrainian law because on his authorization 87 people died in Maidan. On authorization of President Poroshenko 2,600 people died already according to the United Nations. According to the local sources, about 20,000 people died. So if we are genuinely concerned about well-being of Ukrainian people, we should actually do this. We should stop the hostilities on the ground and take Putin on his word and implement the international monitoring of situation on the ground to make sure that there are no intervention from outside as long as peace holds.
Well, let me pick up on that. Taras, in terms of intervention from outside, one of the things President Obama did say was that it's time for NATO members, and he meant us, to pick up our socks and spend 2% of our GDP on defense. Canada is not, has not. We're at 1.3, I think, or something like that. What do you think of that?
Well, I think that's an important recalculation. The NATO leaders now are very, in some ways, happy at the change of situation. This is a revitalized NATO. Only, if I'm not mistaken, 3 or 4 members of NATO actually spend the required amount of their GDP. But I think going back to the question what we can do, inevitably...
Well, is that one of the things we can do? Would that matter?
Yes, that would be, but I think the more important thing that Canada can do, together with in particular the US and Britain, and US and Britain here are important because they are the 2 of the 3 guarantors of Ukraine's territorial integrity and security, going back to when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. So they have a moral duty to support Ukraine with maybe light defensive weaponry, intelligence training. Canada, with its large Ukrainian population, should also back that. So I think on top of economic sanctions, which are going to be now, I think, the toughest coming out in the next few days, with even countries that previously were willing to work with Russia, like France and Germany, now on board, we need to have defensive weaponry, training, advice, and intelligence provided by the US, Canada, and Britain towards the Ukrainian security forces.
Let me ask this follow-up. Have you been, choose my word carefully here, disappointed in the reaction of Ukrainian Canadians to the amount of commitment that they have been prepared to put behind the Prime Minister's tough language on this?
I've been disappointed by both the politicians. I mean, it's one thing empty rhetoric, another actual action. And I've been disappointed by the Ukrainian diaspora in many ways, yes. Because this is a different era to the 1990s. In the 1990s, for example, the Croat diaspora collected something in the region of $50 to $100 million, sent volunteers, sent arms to Croatia, and it won its battle against Serbia. The Ukraine's diaspora has not done that. That's partly because that generation which came to Canada after World War II, my father's generation, most of those have passed away, and they were the ones who gave the most money to the Ukrainian community. And so I was at a demonstration last week outside the Russian consulate in Toronto. 150 people turned up. It's not a huge protest.
Christia, why hasn't this captured the imagination of Ukrainian Canadians in a way that previous conflicts have for their diaspora communities?
Oh, I think it has. I mean,
Well, he just said it hasn't.
Well, I can disagree with Taras much as I love him. You know, I go to a lot of demonstrations. I think that there have been a lot of demonstrations across the country, across the Ukrainian diaspora. There's been a lot of support, and I think that support is partly manifest in pressure, the kind of appropriate democratic pressure on our elected politicians. I think one of the ways you see the Ukrainian Canadian community is in acting on its elected leaders. And one of the things that's been really interesting in Canadian politics is, you know, we talk about our polarized political space. On the Ukrainian issue, there has been cross-party agreement for a strong position in support of Ukraine. I think that's because it's the right thing to do, and I think all parties see that. It's partly because all of us have Ukrainian voters, and those Ukrainian voters are talking to us.
Lucan.
Well, you know, I think you should be really careful what you wish for. You know, to use Croatia as an example, I mean, that really was a neo-fascist government under Tudjman. So do we really want Yugoslavia, ethnic conflict? I mean, one thing I've learned in 25 years of studying Eastern Europe, it can always get worse. And so far, what do we have, like, you know, 3,000, 5,000 deaths? Yugoslavia, half the size of Ukraine, 150,000 deaths. And, you know, this could get much worse. And I really, you know, would be reluctant to get the diaspora involved. That tends to ethnicize conflicts, make it more extremist, make it harder for the government on the ground to compromise. You know, let's think long and hard about this.
Just quickly comparing America and Canada. Canadian politicians of all parties have not been out supporting the provision of defensive aid, military aid to Ukraine, unlike American politicians. So Canadian politicians have been behind the curve on this. I mean, American politicians of both the Democrats and Republicans have been pressuring President Obama to provide American military aid. Canadians haven't.
Okay.
Let's in our we've got about 12, 13 minutes left here, and I want to move this discussion to something that I think you might appreciate more than everybody else, and that is I want to quote John Mearsheimer in Foreign Affairs magazine, who takes this view. Let's read this quote: "Putin's actions should be easy to comprehend. A huge expanse of flat land that Napoleonic France, Imperial Germany, and Nazi Germany all crossed to strike at Russia itself, Ukraine serves as a buffer state of enormous strategic importance to Russia. No Russian leader would tolerate a military alliance that was Moscow's mortal enemy until recently moving into Ukraine. Nor would any Russian leader stand idly by while the West helped install a government there that was determined to integrate Ukraine into the West." Mikhail, do you want to start off on that? Putin's actions, he suggests, are understandable. All you have to do is look at history. You can't have, if you're the Russian leader, an enemy that close to your border. Yes?
I think it is understandable, and Mearsheimer actually makes a comparison to the United States of America. And imagine he says that, say, Canada would be pulled into some sort of anti-American alliance. Would Americans just watch idly and stand by? Probably not. So I agree that many things, actually Mearsheimer's article lays the blame squarely at NATO's feet, and he has a point, because Christia said that something new and unprecedented happened in Europe when Crimea was annexed. Well, something new and unprecedented happened when Serbia was bombed, I might argue, and that when NATO first came into the territory of the sovereign nation without United Nations mandate and changed the situation on the ground. When Kosovo gained independence, against constitutional provisions which were existing at the time in military way, essentially. So Putin just learning from the best. He is looking around, and this is Mearsheimer's point, and he's watching how realpolitik works in the world, and he makes comparable choices.
Lucan, do we live in a bit of a glass house on this one?
Well, I think that the argument doesn't hold water. For one, I think countries should be allowed to choose their international allies. This is not some 19th century world where spheres of influence are set in stone. I mean, Poland was considered part of the Russian sphere of influence. Should they have not been allowed to join the EU? I mean, where does this stop? And this idea that somehow, well, what would the U.S. do if Canada joined with Russia and China? Well, I can tell you one thing. I wouldn't expect them to annex Ontario and create civil war in the BC. I mean, I would hope not. I'm American, so that might be good for me, but
We'd fight back.
Okay, I'd be on your side.
What do you think?
Well, look, I agree with Luke. I think this sort of realpolitik view, which can sound sort of very macho and clear-eyed, neglects the profound differences between the 21st century and the 19th century. In the 21st century, countries and citizens have agency. Ukraine, you have to actually ask the Ukrainians, do you consent to being forevermore a buffer state between Russia and any potential enemies?
But if you're the head of Russia and you want to make sure that for the third century in a row somebody doesn't use Ukraine as a stepping stone to get to you, that's sort of understandable, isn't it?
Well, again, I think you have to actually go beyond the rhetoric and say, did the Ukrainian Maidan, did Petro Poroshenko pose in any way a real security challenge to Russia? And the truth is, absolutely not. And was the level of Western support for Ukraine in any way a military challenge? And the answer, of course, is no. And the final most important answer, and I want to get back to actually a positive vision of Russia, because I lived in Russia for 4 years too. I love Russia, even though I'm now banned by Putin from going there right now.
How do you know that?
How do I know? Because they announced it.
You've been banned.
Yeah, they put a list, they did a tit for tat, and I was one of the Canadian politicians who was banned after we imposed our first set of sanctions. But look, in the 21st century, the way that you have security, the best way to have security is to be an economically prosperous and democratic state living in peace with your prosperous and democratic neighbors. That's the big lesson. Mearsheimer talks about the Second World War. The big lesson European states learned from the Second World War, finally, it took them 2 wars and probably the 19th and 18th centuries too, is the way you have security, build democracy at home, and build good relations with your neighbors. That's the opposite of what Russia is doing right now. And my big hope is that with time, the Russian people are going to see that too. Ukrainians want a good relationship with Russia. I mean, and this notion of Ukraine being divided between the Russophones and the Ukrainophones, Petro Poroshenko, the Ukrainian president, learned Ukrainian in 1996. His wife does not speak Ukrainian. He speaks Russian in his family. It's really a totally bilingual country that wants a good relationship with Russia, and I think that's very achievable.
Okay, again, I'm asking the question because in the interest of really exploring these issues fully, we need to ask, from the Russian point of view, can we understand how they don't want, for their interests, to have potentially a NATO country on their border?
Well, I mean, I think Mikhail's comparison to the US looking at its backyard is a misnomer. That was true in the Cold War.
It's still true.
It's not true today. I mean, countries in Latin America have become democratic. They're not fascist countries anymore.
The Monroe Doctrine's still pretty in there, isn't it?
I wouldn't say it's to the extent of the Cold War. I wouldn't say so. US troops not coming in, propping up right-wing junta regimes as they were in the Cold War. So in that sense, it's changed. And most countries in Latin America and Central America today are democracies. Now, the difference here is that during the May presidential elections, I was there, Christia was there as well, Petro Poroshenko was not supporting NATO membership. Yulia Tymoshenko was. He wasn't. The irony of Putin's actions is that support for NATO membership has gone rocket high.
Because of his actions?
Yes. Now we have the highest support for NATO membership ever in Ukraine, of sort of up to 45%. We also have, as well, in response to Putin's actions, a deterioration of what were very good views of Ukrainians towards Russians. Ukraine's, up till probably 4 or 5 years ago, and in particular the last year or so, something like 80% of Ukrainians wanted to have a positive view of Russians. It was only really West Ukrainians who were anti-Russian. Today it's all changed. And that's because of what's happened.
So should NATO admit Ukraine to Russia to its membership now?
NATO membership is not on the cards. What's changed in the last 5 years is that Putin, firstly he was against NATO enlargement, then he became against EU enlargement. So as Christia pointed out, it's the EU factor that he's somehow, for some reason, sees as a threat.
Let me bring Christian on the Canadian angle here. I know you're not in the government yet, as you would say.
You said it, Steve.
As you would say. But we have relations with Russia. We have important issues with Russia to resolve, mostly around, well, I shouldn't say mostly, but certainly the Arctic is a big one. Our Prime Minister has been very bellicose against Russia's involvement in Ukraine. And I wonder whether there is a part of you that is concerned that whatever bellicosity comes out of his mouth against Russia will affect the issues that Canada and Russia actually need to get along on in the future.
Our party and I personally are really supportive of a strong Canadian position, strongly in support of Ukraine. That's how I would frame it. It's not a position against Russia, it's a position in support of Ukraine, and I think that's absolutely right. Of course there are costs, and those costs are going to be borne by Canada, they're going to be borne by our allies. They're borne particularly by Germany. And Chancellor Merkel actually has now started to talk about how, security and freedom are worth paying an economic price. And I think really all of the Western countries now, it's going to be most of all applied to Europe, but it's going to apply to all of us. We're facing a really hard and I think sad truth, which is freedom isn't free, and maintaining a safe and secure world order post-1991, it turns out, is going to cost all of us more than we had thought. So of course there are costs, but I think the costs of not drawing a line, of not saying this is unacceptable behavior, and of not backing Ukraine and making it really expensive for Russia to continue are much higher.
Mikhail, should we be prepared as Canadians to pay whatever cost we have to pay in order to draw a line in the sand on this issue?
We shouldn't, no, because actually much of this has been created by NATO's expansion, as John Mearsheimer writes. And let me remind you that it was Putin personally who raised the issue of Russia's membership in NATO back in 1999 in an interview in London. And of course it was ridiculed at that time, and Russia was marginalized. Then it was Putin personally who raised an issue about free trade agreement between the European Union and the customs union of Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. Again, he was ridiculed and sent back home. And you cannot ridicule a great power forever. Finally, it starts moving, it starts acting. And let me pose this question. How long are we prepared to suffer for the wrong policy of our politicians, knowing that Russia can actually suffer more and longer? It's in Russian history. Mm-hmm. They can actually take lots of pressure and isolation. They had this history of 70 years of isolation. Some people are learning about that time period. They're learning about coming back to the situation when domestic producers are producing stuff for the market rather than cheap foreign goods flooding the country. So I think Russia can be there in quite a long haul if we take this position that we should somehow punish the regime, that it's Russian problems. And let me tell you this, we talked about Ukrainian diaspora. I consider myself a member of Ukrainian diaspora in Canada. I'm ethnic Russian born in Ukraine, and I know as a fact that many Ukrainians actually share my position that the only thing that requires immediate attention is stopping hostilities on the ground. And give some credit to the Ukrainians, they will figure out how to arrange their country without NATO or Russia or anyone else interfering. Only 1 year ago, 70% of Ukrainians were against NATO membership in 2013. Now this lame figure that Taras gives of 47% in support, after all the troubles that were, after all the propaganda that Ukrainian television gives about Russian atrocities in Ukraine, only 47% for NATO membership, which means whether the rest 53%. They are still against it. This says something about the situation that NATO's troops and increase of NATO's presence in Ukraine is not an answer to these problems.
I want to do a quick follow-up, and I don't mean this to be cute or smart-alecky, but I know you're born in Ukraine, but you don't really think of yourself as a Ukrainian, do you? You think of yourself as ethnically Russian, right?
Well, there is a political identity, there is a national identity, there is ethnic identity. We all have hyphenated identities here, right? So ethnically I'm Russian, yes, but I was born and raised in Western Ukraine, and my first language was a mixture of Russian, Ukrainian, and Yiddish, actually. So
I would say, Steve, if I may,
Sure.
from the way Mikhail pronounces my name, I could tell that he was Ukrainian. I could tell that he was a Ukrainian Russian speaker.
How does he say your name that gives that away?
Because he pronounces it in a way that only people who have grown up with Ukrainian around them do.
Which is how?
Chrestya.
Harder in the back of the throat.
I'm not a linguist, I wouldn't know how to describe it, but I could tell, the first time he pronounced my name, I could tell. And there is, I mean, I do think, you know, to Mikhail's point, it is really important that in thinking about Ukraine, we understand there are ethnic Russians and Russian speakers and Russian-speaking ethnic Ukrainians in Ukraine who are a part of the country. And Ukraine actually, in the 25 years since independence, has been pretty good at managing that. And we do have to be careful to encourage that rather than discourage that. And I think the diaspora as well has to make a real point of being an inclusive diaspora, an inclusive community.
Okay, and we're going to give Chrestya the last word today on this, trying to say it both ways so that we don't betray anything here. I want to thank the four of you for coming in tonight and helping us out with this. Hopefully our viewers understand the nuances of this story a lot better now than they did at the beginning of the evening. Much appreciated, everybody. Thanks.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.